The studio froze. Every single person in that room, from the cameras to the audience, from the producers to the rival family, stopped breathing. Steve Harvey, the man who had seen it all in 40 years of television, stood at his podium with his mouth slightly open, microphone dangling from his hand, staring at a family who had just done something no one in Family Feud history had ever done. They refused the money. Not because they didn't need it, but because they needed something else more. What happened next wasn't scripted. It wasn't rehearsed. It was raw, real, and it changed everyone in that studio forever. But to understand why Steve Harvey broke protocol, stopped the show, and did what he did, you need to know how this moment began. You need to know about Margaret, the grandmother in the wheelchair at the front of that family. And you need to know about the photos she held in her trembling hands. It was a Tuesday afternoon taping at the Family Feud studio in Atlanta. The energy was electric as always. Lights blazing, audience pumped, Steve Harvey in his signature purple three-piece suit, working the crowd with that magnetic charisma that had made him a household name. Two families stood at their podiums, the Johnsons on the left, and the Rodriguez family on the right. Standard setup. Standard game. Or so everyone thought. The Johnsons were from a small town in North Carolina. Mother Sandra, 42, a nurse who worked double shifts. Father Marcus, 45, a mechanic with calloused hands and a quiet smile. Their two teenage kids, Jasmine and Derek. And at the front of their podium, in a wheelchair, sat Margaret Johnson, 78 years old, the matriarch of the family. She wore a soft cardigan despite the studio heat, and in her lap, she clutched a small framed photograph. During the pre-show briefing, the producers had noticed Margaret. "Is she okay to play?" one asked Sandra. "She's stronger than all of us," Sandra replied, her voice cracking slightly. "She wanted to be here. She needed to be here." The producers nodded and moved on. They had no idea what was coming. The game began normally. Steve did his usual banter, the families laughed, the buzzers buzzed. The Johnsons were doing well, surprisingly well. Margaret, despite her frail appearance, was sharp as a tack, calling out answers that lit up the board. "Grandma's got game," Steve shouted, and the audience roared. The Rodriguez family was gracious, applauding every point. It was wholesome. It was fun. It was Family Feud at its best. But then came the final round. And that's when everything changed. That's when Steve Harvey stopped being a host and became something else entirely. The Johnsons had won. The board was theirs. They had accumulated enough points to go to fast money. $20,000 was on the line. The studio audience was on their feet, chanting, "Let's go! Let's go!" Steve walked over to the family, microphone in hand, ready to send Marcus and Sandra to the fast money round. This was the moment. This was what they came for. But as Steve approached, he noticed something. Margaret was crying. Not tears of joy. These were different. Her hands were shaking, and she was holding that photograph up to her chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. Sandra, her daughter, had her arm around her mother's shoulder, also crying. The teenagers stood silent, their eyes red. Marcus had his head down. Steve's smile faded. His comedic timing, his quick wit, all of it evaporated in an instant. He had been doing this long enough to know when something was wrong. He knelt down next to Margaret's wheelchair, ignoring the producer's signals to keep the show moving. The cameras were still rolling, but Steve didn't care. "Mrs. Johnson," he said softly, his voice barely picked up by the microphone. "Are you okay?" The studio went silent. You could hear the hum of the stage lights. Margaret looked up at him, tears streaming down her weathered face, and she shook her head. "No, baby," she whispered. "I'm not." Steve's eyes widened. This wasn't part of the show. This was real life crashing into primetime television. Sandra stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Steve, my mother, she's been battling stage 4 lung cancer for 2 years. The doctors gave her 6 months. That was 18 months ago. She's a fighter. But last week, they told us, They told us there's nothing more they can do. Hospice starts next month. The studio gasped. Audible, collective, heartbroken gasps. Steve closed his eyes for a moment, his jaw tightening. When he opened them, they were glistening. Margaret held up the photograph. It was old, faded, the kind you keep in a drawer and only take out on special occasions. In it, a young girl, maybe 8 years old, stood next to a woman who looked exactly like Margaret, just decades younger. "That's me and my mama," Margaret said, her voice barely a whisper. "She died when I was 9. Cancer. Back then, we didn't have the words for it. We didn't have the help. She just faded away. And I held her hand until the end." Steve's hand went to his mouth. The rival family, the Rodriguez family, were crying now too. The audience was silent, save for the sound of sniffles and tissues being pulled from purses. "My whole life," Margaret continued, "I wanted to do something in her memory. Something that mattered. And now I'm here, at the end of mine, and I just wanted to feel close to her one more time." And then Sandra said the words that would stop the show cold. The words that would make Steve Harvey do something he had never done before. "Steve," Sandra said, her voice shaking but resolute, "we don't want to play for the money." Steve blinked. The producers in the booth froze. The audience didn't understand. "What?" Steve asked, not sure he'd heard correctly. "We don't want the $20,000, Marcus added, stepping forward. "We want to donate our winnings to the American Cancer Society. In Margaret's mother's name. In Margaret's name. We want their fight to mean something." The studio exploded. Not with cheers. With something deeper. A collective, guttural sob. People were standing, hands over their mouths, tears streaming. The Rodriguez family left their podium and walked across the stage. Maria Rodriguez, the mother, approached Margaret and knelt beside her, taking her hand. "You are so brave," she whispered. Margaret squeezed her hand. Steve Harvey stood up. He turned away from the camera for a moment, and those watching closely could see his shoulders shaking. When he turned back, his face was wet with tears, his tough guy exterior completely shattered. He pulled the purple pocket square from his suit jacket and wiped his eyes. "In 40 years, he said, his voice breaking, I have never seen anything like this." He walked over to the producer's booth and said something off mic. The producers nodded. Steve returned to the stage and addressed the audience. "We're going to take a break," he said. "Because what happens next isn't about the show. It's about this family. It's about Margaret. And it's about making sure her story, and her mother's story, is told the way it deserves to be told. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead." The cameras stopped rolling, but the moment didn't end. Steve Harvey pulled a chair onto the stage and sat directly in front of Margaret. For 20 minutes the studio sat in silence as Steve listened. He listened to Margaret talk about her mother, about her childhood, about her own battle with cancer. He listened to Sandra talk about watching her mother fight, about the sleepless nights, about the fear. He listened to Marcus talk about feeling helpless, about wanting to fix something that couldn't be fixed. And then Steve did something no one expected. He took off his jacket. The iconic purple jacket that was part of his signature look. He draped it gently over Margaret's shoulders. "This," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is for you. For your strength. For your mother's strength. And for every person out there fighting a battle no one else can see." Margaret pulled the jacket tight around her, burying her face in the fabric, and sobbed. But Steve wasn't done. He pulled a business card from his pocket. Not a prop. His actual card. "When you leave here today," he said, "you call this number. I don't care what time it is. You call, and you tell them Steve Harvey sent you. We're going to make sure the American Cancer Society knows about you, about your mother, and about what you did here today. And we're going to make sure your donation is just the beginning." The audience was on their feet now, not clapping, but standing in silent reverence. The Rodriguez family had their arms around each other, crying. Even the crew members, the hardened television professionals who had seen thousands of episodes, were wiping their eyes. This wasn't television anymore. This was humanity at its rawest, most beautiful form. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. Steve Harvey stood up and addressed the audience. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice steady now, filled with purpose. "The network is going to donate $20,000 to the American Cancer Society in Margaret's name and her mother's name. The Johnsons aren't going to lose a dime for their generosity. But that's not enough." He turned to the camera. "If you're watching this at home, if you've ever lost someone to cancer, if you've ever felt helpless, if you've ever wanted to do something that mattered, I want you to go to the American Cancer Society website right now and donate. $1. $5. Whatever you can. And in the comments, write for Margaret." The studio erupted. Not just applause. A standing ovation that lasted 5 full minutes. People were hugging strangers. The rival family embraced the Johnsons. Margaret, still wrapped in Steve's jacket, was smiling through her tears. And Steve Harvey, the comedian, the host, the entertainer, stood there with his arms crossed, nodding slowly, letting the moment breathe. When the cameras came back on to finish the taping, Steve didn't do his usual closing bit. He didn't crack a joke. He stood next to Margaret, his hand on her shoulder, and spoke directly to the lens. "This is why we do this show," he said quietly. "Not for the laughs. Not for the ratings. But for moments like this. For people like Margaret. For families like the Johnsons. For reminders that in a world that can feel so cruel, so broken, there is still goodness. There is still love. There is still hope." The episode aired 3 weeks later. Within hours, the American Cancer Society reported that donations had spiked by over 300%. The hashtag for Margaret trended worldwide. Celebrities shared the clip. News outlets ran stories. And Steve Harvey, in interviews afterward, would tear up every single time he talked about it. "That family taught me something," he said in one interview. "They taught me that the best prize you can ever win isn't money. It's meaning. It's legacy. It's love." Margaret Johnson passed away 6 weeks after the episode aired. She was surrounded by her family, wrapped in Steve Harvey's purple jacket, holding the photograph of her mother. At her funeral, Sandra read a letter that Steve had sent. In it he wrote, "Margaret, you did more in one afternoon than most people do in a lifetime. You reminded us all what matters. And your mother, wherever she is so proud of you. As am I." The jacket was buried with her. The photograph was placed in her hands. And on her headstone, paid for by an anonymous donor that many suspect was Steve Harvey himself, the inscription reads, "Margaret Johnson. Beloved mother, grandmother, and warrior." Her fight meant everything. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. The legacy of that day didn't end with Margaret. The American Cancer Society created a fund in her name. The Rodriguez family, the rival family from that episode, stayed in touch with the Johnsons and attended Margaret's funeral. Steve Harvey, in the years since, has used his platform to share Margaret's story at cancer benefits, charity events, and interviews. "She changed me," he said simply. And anyone who watched that episode knows it's true. Because sometimes, in the middle of a game show, in the bright lights and the noise and the pursuit of a cash prize, something bigger happens. Something that transcends entertainment. Something that reminds us that we're all human, we're all fragile, and we're all capable of extraordinary grace. Margaret refused the money not because she didn't need it, but because she understood something the rest of us forget, that the greatest victories aren't measured in dollars. They're measured in love, in memory, and in the legacy we leave behind. In the months after Margaret passed, Steve Harvey would often pause during tapings when he saw families embrace, when he heard stories of struggle, when someone mentioned a loved one lost to illness. His staff noticed the change. "He's different now," one producer said. "He stops more. He listens more. He cares in a way that goes beyond the show. That purple jacket became legendary, not because of its price or style, but because of what it represented, a moment when entertainment stepped aside and humanity took center stage. The American Cancer Society Fund, established in Margaret's name, has raised over $2 million to date. Every donation, no matter how small, carries the same note. For Margaret. Her photograph, the one she clutched that day, was scanned and printed on the fund's website. Thousands have seen it. Thousands have been moved by it. And thousands have donated because of a grandmother who, in her final act, chose to give rather than receive. And on that day, in that studio, Margaret Johnson won everything.